Hello, and now we are going to, Lord willing, finish up what I might call the Jerusalem Council part of Acts 15, ending with verse 35. And then next week we'll begin the last part of Acts 15, which is where Paul and Silas begin their second missionary journey, in which they'll go to Greece. So what's happened in the Jerusalem Council? Well, Paul and Barnabas went on the first missionary journey. They found themselves increasingly preaching to non-Jews or Gentiles. And when they get back, there's some controversy. So there's some ultra-conservative Christians who say, hey, unless these Gentiles are willing to become Jews and get circumcised and follow the laws of Moses, they can't be saved. And then you had Peter get up and said, hey, God gave him, he didn't say hey, I don't know what the Greek word for hey is, gave them the Holy Spirit. And so God has basically said they're in and they're equal and there ain't nothing you can do about it. And then there's Paul and Barnabas who get up and say, we had miracles that happened, and that means that God endorses this mission to the Gentiles. And then James gets up and renders a final verdict. His verdict is basically, in my interpretation, that Jewish and Gentile Christians are going to be, first of all, Gentiles are saved if they have the Holy Spirit and their heart has been purified by faith. I'm filling in some gaps, but I believe this is what the text would have us believe James' position is. They're in, they have the Holy Spirit, and we can eat with them. Jewish and Gentile Christians can have table fellowship as long as the Gentiles will do four things. One, stay away from sexual immorality. Two, not serve meat that's been sacrificed to an idol. Three, not serve meat that has been strangled to death rather than had its blood drained. And because four, need to stay away from blood. And James has a letter written, and this letter is sent to Antioch and Cilicia and Syria at the hands of two people named Judas and Silas. And so that's where we join our heroes at verse 30 as they begin to go north. So therefore, good word to know, on the one hand, they, having been released, when the article comes before men or death, and there's no noun to go with it, it can mean he, she, it, or in this case, they, because it's plural. Therefore, they, having been released, so theta epsilon tells me aorist passive, and unt tells me it's a participle. So this is an aorist passive participle. S tells me nominative masculine plural. So having, because it's aorist, been, because it's passive, released, because it's apoluo, which, by the way, is also the word for divorce, but that's not what's going on here. Having been released, they went down to Antioch. So elf tells me what? Aorist diverkamai. So with the on ending there, it's aorist active indicative third plural from katerkamai. They think of going up and down probably more in terms of elevation. Antioch is down from Jerusalem, if that makes any sense. Of course, I grew up with a globe. They didn't. And having gathered together the multitude, so my aunt is a active participle. Agagagagag is the aorist of ago. So this is an aorist active participle. S is nominative masculine plural, so it's of sunago. Having gathered the multitude, they delivered the letter, the epistle. Didomi doso edoka dedoka. So this is the aorist of didomi. It doesn't have the funny reduplication, so it's not present or imperfect because of the augment there. It's an aorist active indicative third plural from epididymi, not to be confused with your epidermis. Okay, verse 31. And having read, they rejoiced. Okay, so my aunt is a active participle, and I know that this is aorist because the present stem uses genosko. So there's not an iota. Because there's not an iota between these two, I know this is aorist. So this is aorist active participle. What's S tell me? Nominative masculine plural from anagonosko. Anna. Okay, so having read, they rejoice. This is from Chorizo, is it? maybe. Could be Cairo. Okay, well, in fact, maybe from both. They may be variations on the same word. Augment, letters probably missing. It's not, doesn't look like the present of either of those. So it's aorist active indicative third plural from either charizo or Cairo. Let me do a quick glance at my notebook. Cairo is what this Greek New Testament is telling me. So let's go with Cairo, not the Egypt Cairo, but Cairo as in I rejoice. They rejoiced at the encouragement, which if this is after, or if we should think of this in terms of the post Galatians 2 conflict, they would rejoice, because remember in Galatians 2, as I'll talk about tomorrow in the Patron video, there was a separation made between Jewish and Gentile Christians. They didn't have communion together, they didn't eat together, and so it would be encouraging if these four things allowed them to eat together again and have the Lord's Supper. That would be encouraging. Verse 32, both Judas and Silas, and they themselves being prophets. Also, when Kai is not, when and doesn't work with Kai, we downshift into either also or even. They themselves also being prophets. When autos is in the nominative case, it intensifies the subject. It becomes an intensive pronoun, so to speak. And so Judas and Silas are the subject. So Judas and Silas also themselves being prophets. You can see that this is myont is an active participle without a participle word. That's often ami, the verb to be. So this is a present participle, nominative masculine plural from ami, being prophets. Through much word, they encouraged the brothers. Sometimes much words, especially when they come from me, are not more encouraging. They just make us go to sleep. But the much word of Judas and Silas encouraged them. This is see the sigma alpha. This is aorist. There's the augment. Aorist active indicative third plural because of the nu from parakaleo. Okay. By the way, parakaleo is used in common speech in Greek today. It means both you're welcome and also please. So, you know, I'd like some more spanakopita, parakalo. And if someone says thanks to you, epharisto, which, by the way, is a word for Eucharist, means I give thanks. Your response is parakalo, you're welcome. Okay, not important, but it has a tone of encouragement. The Paraclete in John, Holy Spirit's the Paraclete. They encouraged the brothers and they strengthened them. So sigma alpha, xi is the key to a hidden sigma, so we have a hidden sigma alpha. It's aorist. There's the augment. Episterizo? Yes, episterizo, third plural from the nu. So it's aorist active indicative third plural from episterizo, to strengthen. Okay, shorter reading today, verse 33. And having done time, no, that's probably not a good translation given the English. Having passed time, sigma alpha tells me it's aorist. Unt tells me it's an active participle. Aorist active participle. S tells me nominative masculine plural from poieo. And having done time, having passed time, they were released. Theta eta tells me aorist passive. Son is third person plural. So it's aorist passive indicative third person plural. There's the augment from apoluo. We saw this earlier in today's passage. They were released, were because it's passive. And aorist tells me it's past tense. They were, not are, but were. They were released with peace from the brothers and sisters, because they're going to use a masculine, even if there's a lot of women. The bias of the gender of the language is to use the masculine. From the brothers to the ones who sent them. So as it turns out, it's mostly just Judas and unnamed people who go back to Jerusalem. Everybody else seems to stay in Antioch. This is a participle. My unt is an active participle. So this is an active participle. The article never lies, so I'm guessing that os is accusative masculine plural. The alpha is all that tells me it's aorist, because liquid verbs don't do sigmas. So the sigma's not there. So this is aorist active participle, accusative masculine plural from apostello. Notice that there's only one lambda, and it's gone from an to an a, internal lengthening. So there's a number of indications that this is an aorist form. Now my stage 1 translation of an aorist active participle is having something. In this case, having sent. Stage 1. Stage 2, I ask, does it have an article? It does. So I'm going to use who or that. So to the having sent ones. I have to come up with a ones because there's no noun there. So that's called the substantive use of a participle or of an adjective. And it's an adjectival participle because it has an article. So it's a substantive, adjectival, substantive participle. So to the having sent ones. Now the third stage, I'm going to clean it up. To the ones who had sent them. So having passed time, they were released with peace from the brothers to the ones who had sent them. And ding, we've come up with a nice, fine translation for this participle. Verse 35, and Paul and Barnabas, oh, wait a minute, 33, 35, we'll come back to that. But Paul, we're missing 34. But Paul and Barnabas passed time or remained in Antioch. Augment here, right? This is, I think, imperfect. It doesn't seem like there's any funny business with this particular form here. So let's go ahead with it being imperfect. They were passing time. Aorist active indicative third plural in Antioch. It's kind of hard to know because the iota would, okay, never mind. Ignore that. They spent time in Antioch teaching and preaching the good news of the word of the Lord. So this is myont is an active participle. It's a present active participle. No funny business with the stem. Present active participle, nominative masculine plural. And this is a present deponent participle, nominative masculine plural. Euangelizomai, its deponent. Preach the good news. With also many others. So there's a lot of preaching going on. A lot of teaching, a lot of preaching, a lot of apostling going on at the Church of Antioch. Good place. Okay, you'll notice that some manuscripts, in fact, the manuscripts behind the King James, this wouldn't be, the versification, the verses were added by Stephanus in 1550. So the verses are very, very late into the equation. And so this verse 34 must have been in the text of Stephanus. And therefore, I'm quite certain that if I were to get out of King James, I would find that verse 34 is there. Verse 34 says something like, and it seemed to Silas to remain there. The use of autou to mean there is very unusual in Acts. I've not seen it yet. It's more of a classic, I think, use of the word. It's not really a very common New Testament use of it at all, which is a hint that this probably is not original. We have seen, however, it seemed in this passage. We have seen that use of it seemed. It seemed good. So the edoxe, which is the aorist active indicative third singular from dokeo, does fit the style of Luke. Epimenai is the aorist infinitive of epimeno, internal lengthening. It's a new liquid verb, so it doesn't do sigmas. So this verse says that and Silas remained there. So when we're doing textual, so there are some manuscripts that have this verse and some manuscripts that don't. There are several different manuscript traditions. Scholars have come up with traditions, whether they're real or not. I'm not entirely certain. I've always had some doubts about them, but it seems to work to talk about things like this. So the Greek textual tradition behind the King James represents basically the church tradition. So from about, the 300s, 400s on, after Christianity stopped being persecuted, there was a somewhat of a standardization of the Greek text. And so it's no surprise at all that the vast majority of medieval texts which is the vast majority of texts, read pretty much the same, and that's the text behind the King James. We might call that Greek tradition the Byzantine tradition, as it were. It's generally thought that the more accurate, and I mean accurate in terms of preservation of the very original reading, is sometimes called the Alexandrian tradition. It's called that, I suppose, because of Codex Sinaiticus, which comes from Egypt. I guess that's why it would be called that. So Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, both of which date to the early 300s probably, are often thought to represent probably the cleanest text. Westcott and Hort, of course, maybe Hort especially, believed that if Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus agreed on any reading, then that was overwhelmingly likely to have been the original reading. And of course, since then, in the 1800s, there have also been a number of important papyri that have been discovered, and they tend to agree with that tradition as well. So we call that the Alexandrian tradition. Interestingly enough, there is another tradition, sometimes called the Western tradition. And here we're talking about manuscripts in Latin primarily, and one very important codex called Codex Beeza, which is Codex D. And Codex D has this verse in it. The version of Codex, the version of Acts in Codex D is significantly longer than Acts as we know it. It's quite an interesting text. I studied at Asbury with a professor who had done his dissertation on Codex D, Bob Lyon. And and the thing is, the additions in Codex D they're not heresy. They're not these great theological things. The additions in Codex D are things like this verse, and Silas remained there. And you can understand where this verse would come from, right? Because verse 33 says that they went back to Jerusalem. And yet in just a few verses, we're going to find Silas leaving with Paul on the second missionary journey. So seems like some scribe at some point trying to help us out here. And I assume that the overwhelming majority of scribes who were trying to be helpful who did this, introduced a note. Maybe it was originally in the margin. It may not have originally been in the text itself. Maybe they put it in the margin as a kind of a clarifying remark, or maybe they copied it in. But it explains, okay, Silas didn't go back to Jerusalem. Now, maybe Silas did go back to Jerusalem, because you can go to Jerusalem and come back to Antioch. That's not a big deal. We don't know, because I think the next verse, verse 36, and after certain days, that could have been a long time. Plenty of time for Silas to go to Jerusalem and come back. So the general rule with textual criticism, which is the science of trying to decide what the original said, because we don't have any of the original manuscripts of Acts, of course, it basically asks, create a storyline so there are two parts to textual criticism. One is the manuscripts, which I've just kind of talked about, Alexandrian, Byzantine, Western. And then the second thing is you create a storyline. This is called internal evidence, and try to say, okay, how can I best explain how the different variations were introduced into the text? And so I've given you my suggestion, namely that this verse was introduced into the text to try to clarify how it is that Silas seems to go back to Jerusalem, and then he's still in Antioch in order to go on a second missionary journey. So that it's easier for me to explain why this sentence would be added to the text than it is for me to explain why it would have been taken out. There's no particular good reason to take this verse out, right? By the way, Codex D, the little variations are often kind of funny. So I didn't mention it, but back in chapter 12, when Peter is escaping from prison, Codex D says something like, he went down 12 steps. I can't remember how many steps, but it tells you how many steps he went down from the prison. Who puts that in the text? Somebody did. But anyway, so Codex D is a very interesting manuscript. And it's I can't remember how much longer it is. Is it 10% longer than Acts, as we would say what the original was? But this is anyway, here we have another one of the 16 verses that aren't in the modern translations because of the manuscripts. So we saw one in Acts 30, 8:37, I believe it was. And then here's a second one, this in Acts, and we'll encounter one more, I guess, when we get to like chapter 24. Okay, well, and let me say that the early copyists, not all of them, but it seems to me that some of the early copyists of the New Testament were a little bit like Eugene Peterson. That is to say, they were more interested in the message being clear than they were on keeping the exactitude of the text. Now, I know that's not what you've heard, and maybe, and a lot of what you've heard has been from the Old Testament copying of, and pertains to the Masoretes who copied the Old Testament, and they lived in the Middle Ages. But the evidence from the earliest manuscripts seems to be that many early copyists were interested in the message, not the exact wording. And of course, I believe this fits with the general flavor of Christianity, which is that God takes on the flesh of the people to whom he is speaking. That God doesn't expect us to get up the mountain. I'm sorry, unless you get it perfect, you can't see me. But God comes down to us. He gets down dirty in the mud with us. He's not sinning. I'm not talking about sin. He takes on our flesh. And even the Greek of the New Testament is street Greek. It's not lofty literary Greek. It's the kind of common everyday Greek. Not Luke so much. Luke tends to be a little bit better Greek. And so if we really had to go with the exact wording, if it was really important to worry about the exact wording, we shouldn't even be reading it in English, right? The Bible, we would be like the Muslims who only read the Bible in Arabic. If that level of exactitude of wording is that important, then you just shouldn't read English, because then you're never getting the exact wording in English. You can't, going from one language to another. That just doesn't seem to be God's philosophy. God's philosophy is that he wants to be understood, not that he wants you to get it perfect. And so many of the early copyists seem to have introduced marginal notes and maybe occasionally harmonized things. They're trying to resolve problems, right? But we do have some manuscripts that seem to have been from more exacting personalities like Codex Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and so forth. Well, this has been our YouTube video on the Greek for today.